what's the next level KPI that can significantly change performance in the restoration business or any business, really?
I keep hearing these folks tell me that my gross margins on water jobs should be 75%. But on my P&L, Josh, you're showing me that we've got 50% COGS. Isn't that the same thing? And I'm going, interesting conversation. Let's dive into that a little bit.
What are the structures? What are the rhythms that can turn KPIs into behavior change?
Let's just talk about that invoice leg, right?
Mhm.
If I'm watching that invoice leg start to grow, do I have an understanding for why it's growing?
Where do you see companies unintentionally bleeding profit that maybe doesn't show up in the first glance?
Did you know that for every dollar you invoice, you're giving away 15% of it? We're debt free, but we haven't made payroll in 2 weeks. Or we're debt free, but our AP is some crazy percentage of our revenue. Now, if you want to get to the details of some things that I would look at.
Hey, everybody. Welcome back to another episode of Violand's GPS podcast, Growing Professional Skills. I am your host, Jeff Jones, and with me again is Violand Business Development Advisor, Mr. Josh Bachman. So this is part 2. In the first one, Josh dove into numbers and KPIs to help you have a better understanding of how to make decisions off of your financial reports and what you need to look out for. And today is going to be the advanced version of it. We're going to do an advanced financial decision making. We're probably going to lean a little heavy on the restoration side, Josh, that being your background, but I know a lot of the answers you have are going to go across the board to businesses in the trades. So we appreciate everybody. And Josh, welcome back.
Thanks, Jeff. Appreciate having me back.
So last time, you really helped us understand the fundamentals of financial reports. But today, we're going to push more into the strategic level. So when you're looking at some of the most successful companies out there, what are they doing differently with their financials that maybe others sort of overlook?
Jeff, I really think it comes down to the companies I've seen that really are successful. And I'll double down on this. I know we touched about it with the basic, but I think this parlays nicely into talking about the more advanced companies is they really have settled in on a rhythm to how they're going to look at those things. So they're really dedicated to that. And they say that, hey, you know what? It's the end of the month or it's the first 10 days of the month and we're going to do this process at this time. They really have that diligence around making sure that they're doing those things on a regular. And I think, and I know we'll probably get to this as we continue to talk through things today, Jeff, but we also have, they also have some action items that they've identified from what they're seeing in the numbers and saying, okay, when we see this, we know to do this, right? When we see something tricking over here, we can make a little tweak or have a conversation or just maybe, like I said last time, just ask that right next question so that you can get to where you need to go. So I think the ones that really perform they kind of have a rhythm and they kind of have a plan.
Do you almost see where they're using kind of I don't know, I'm going to throw this out, maybe a red, yellow, green strategy, and they're looking at the numbers on their reports and they're good. So those numbers are green. They're starting to be concerned. There's a yellow and then there's an uh-oh moment where there's red right there. Or is there a way that you would recommend doing that?
No, I think I like the red, yellow, green just because it's easily understood for everybody. And I think what that also allows us to do is it allows us to stay high level when we need to be high level. And if high level shows green, then maybe that time or that period or that time, that instances of us looking into our numbers, we don't need to dive down much further. When I talk about production meetings as an example, and I'll use production as an analogy here for financials, there are times and places where I don't need to talk about every single project that's in production. Sometimes I can just say in phase or it's green and we can move on. I think that same kind of process could happen here with your financials and you could go, hey, great. This looks like it's trending correctly. It's green. You know what? Let's not dive into this. And, oh, you know what? This one is red. Probably worth pressing pause, taking, stop for a second and take that to the next level. So yeah, absolutely.
Well, I know you're a big production manager guy. I've got a little bit of experience doing that over the years. When you're holding those meetings with give the audience, what are the KPIs you're looking at? What are the numbers that we're going to color code when we're there?
Ooh, I think that depends a little bit on what you're doing. And so I know we talk into here on this on your podcast, Jeff, we're talking to a vast audience, so I don't want to be super specific, but I will be for a second as a
Mhm.
way an analogy. I'm going to probably answer that question completely different if I'm talking about construction versus if I'm talking about mitigation or if I'm talking about plumbing or if I'm talking about air duct cleaning. I think I'll answer those things all a little bit differently because they all have a little bit different life cycles.
Okay.
Uh, like on construction, if I'm going to be, in a project that's going to go on 6 weeks, I want to make sure that it's trending through its process. So I'm going to be very key on making sure that I understand your estimated completion dates and that your percent completes are moving along in the right way and that you're on budget, right? If it's mitigation where I kind of, what is it? What do we do in mitigation? We ready, fire, aim. Then in that world, I'm probably not going to be really so concerned about your budget. Like, hey, Jeff, are you running this mitigation process to budget? And you're going to go, I'm supposed to have a budget. That's a whole nother conversation, Jeff. Maybe that could be podcast number 3 is talking about how to budget a mitigation project. But
Don't mitigation projects only last 3 days, anyways?
that's the thing. That's
Oh,
the
cool.
um
Yeah. What do you need to do there? Come on.
I mean, it says I'm only going to be there 3 days.
Right.
I don't know that's true. Then yeah, Jeff, it does. The life cycles are fast enough where I don't need to necessarily have a whole lot of oversight into that from the red, yellow, green. But if I'm going to be there 3 months, different conversation, right? So the KPIs do shift for me depending on what I'm looking at.
Okay. Let's jump back into the financials here. Do you use a rolling 12-month P&L or trend analysis with your clients?
I use a little bit of both, and I'll use that same process, Jeff. Like I use a rolling 12 to look at overall general patterns, but sometimes a rolling 12 can hide what may actually be happening in a month. And so what can happen if I use a rolling 12 and look at it, even if I use like a summary rolling 12 or like a summarized 12 months in the past, sometimes that can hide some of the inconsistencies in the roller coaster that I might have been on. So I tend to look at it. Yes, I'll look at a rolling 12 to help me develop trends, but I also want to look at where are we at in the last couple periods? What's that looking like? And seeing how that's playing out. So it's probably, well, not probably. For me, it's definitely a combination of both. I'm using the rolling 12 to establish some trend lines, some benchmarks to look at, and then the way to ask some questions. But sometimes the rolling 12 can hide because of its, summary. It can hide a little bit about what might be going on currently.
Okay. So basic KPIs like revenue and gross profit, those ones are the really well-known KPIs and most people are going to take a look at: job cycle completion date and AR. But what are the overlooked or the underutilized KPIs you really think, once you get those initial ones in play, what's the next level KPI that can significantly change performance in the restoration business or any business really?
Hmm. Jeff, I think it's a great question, but I will pause for a second before I go down into that and say that there's probably a conversation to have about revenue first,
Okay.
right? Yes, you said
Absolutely.
you said yes, we need to, or we understand and we know how to do that. But I find with my clients that sometimes we have some very interesting conversations about how we recognize revenue.
Okay.
And if we're not careful about how we're doing that, or we not systemized around doing it the same way every time, that could end up showing us a really weird story. Like we sign a contract. If we recognize that as revenue when I signed a contract, boy, that could show me some weird things, right? Because I have a lot of revenue here at this month, but I have no expenses because I haven't produced anything yet. So I look like I'm a winner. Uh,
Right.
and then in 2 months, I've got all these expenses and no revenue because I recognized it 3 quarters ago or 3 periods ago. And I look like, oh my gosh, the world's falling and I'm losing because I had expense with no revenue. So I think, yes, we say revenue is an easy one and we understand it, but there's also, before we start diving down into too many KPIs, I think it's important that we do recognize, hey, what are we calling revenue?
Mhm.
And go to your second one, what are we calling gross profit? What are we building into gross profit so we understand what that means to us? Like the typical example I get in was, Jeff, do you job cost your project managers across whatever industry you want to look at? That's a conversation to have. There's no right or wrongs there.
Mhm.
Um, it's just that you need to understand what that means so that if I tell you that I do, and Jeff, you don't do that, we're gonna have very different gross margin targets. And we just need to understand that very, very closely. So I think even in some of the more understood KPIs that we talk about, there's still some nuances in there that need to be explored. so that we can make sure on the same board there, comparing, apples to apples as we're having a conversation around that.
So why would somebody job cost that versus why should somebody not?
I think the conversation that I have around that often is: are we trying to find out whether our PMs are being efficient with what they're doing? Meaning, I'm producing a $5,000 job, but it took 10 hours from a PM on it versus a $5,000 job that took 2 hours from a PM on it. We're trying to look at efficiencies and see what might be going on there. So there is an argument to be had. I always come back to, is the juice worth the squeeze kind of conversation there, and go, wow, if I knew that data, would it really change my decision about what I do with that PM, or whether he's being successful, or whether that's the right kind of job for that PM? So in my experience, Jeff, as I analyzed it and looked at it, I just didn't, again, you're asking a Josh-ism here. The
Mhm.
Josh, I would say that it's not worth the squeeze, and I'm not going to go through all the efforts of having a PM try to track his hours towards a particular job. Right now, I'd be happy, and maybe this is because I've been around a lot of PMs, and maybe, just maybe, it's because I've been a PM myself. I'm
That
just
was a long time ago, buddy. A long time ago.
maybe I'd just be happy if a PM could put in, his job notes and take some good pictures for me and that kind of stuff. So now I'm gonna ask him to track hours on top of that. Let's just set the level where it needs to be.
When you're doing that though, you're not really looking at dollar figure though, as much as you're looking at percentage, right?
Yeah, probably so. You're looking at a percentage against what you're doing from, what that job size is, and comparing things out. But I still think, because you're doing it at a percentage, Jeff,
Mhm.
I still think you're going to have to end up tracking the individual hour or the individual
Sure.
minute. And where does that start and stop? And then we open ourselves up to, Pandora's box worth of questions on, okay, I was thinking about the Jeff Jones project, so I'm going to bill these hours to this. And
Mhm.
I'm thinking about the Josh Bachman project, so I'm going to bill those hours to that. Where does that start and stop? Very difficult to go through, and now I end up having a system to maintain that system, and I start to lose money.
So
So,
where are some other areas then when we go back to gross profit now? Go back to gross profit with this. Where are some areas where you're seeing companies out there get tripped up in figuring out what that looks like?
Um, I think that's fairly well understood. I really think what I just talked about with the PMs is probably the most kind of driven conversation
Mhm.
around. It's interesting, Jeff, because I was with a client today who asked a question around gross margin. And he's like, "Gosh, I keep hearing these folks tell me that my gross margins on water jobs should be 75%, but on my P&L, Josh, you're showing me that we've got 50% COGS. Isn't that the same thing? I'm a mitigation only company. Why do I have this at 70%? And that's what people tell me that I need to be chasing. And then you show me your P&L and L and you smile at me when I'm at 50. And I'm going, interesting conversation. Let's dive into that a little bit. And I think that's part of the breakdown between a job costed or job level gross margin and then a P&L level gross margin. And I think
Mhm.
it's careful that we do define those things. So again, now we're breaking down what was an easy KPI into a couple different things again. A job level gross margin is going to be basically just what it costs to produce that job, my job, and then the costs that are associated with doing that, meaning primarily labor, materials, those kinds of things. And then at a P&L level, I'm going to start to build in things like my fuel to get to that over there. Again, that's one of those things. Do I want to split that apart? Do I want to say, okay, great. I tracked this many miles to drive to the Jeff Jones job. Let's go ahead and job cost those miles into the Jeff Jones job. That to me sounds like a world I don't want to be in. And even though I'm analytical and like numbers, I don't think I like them to that degree.
Mhm.
Um, does it provide value to me? Is it going to change if I knew that information? Is it going to change how I went and did things? Let me give you an example if you don't mind, Joe.
Yeah, go for it.
So the company I most recently came from, we were very anal about our numbers and tracking things, and we tracked our materials down to the amount of rags and furniture blocks that we put on a mitigation project, so that we can know exactly what our materials cost are. And we had a person whose job it was to do basically nothing. I'm making myself sound really old, before we got into the advanced computer systems, where her job was basically nothing but to go through and track our materials purchases and post those onto each job.
Mhm.
So we were paying a full person's salary with benefits and burden and all the things to keep up with the system. And after doing that for a period of 10 years, we found out that, you know what, on a mitigation project, it averages between 6 and 9%. So why couldn't we just use 6 or 9% and not go through this whole process of keeping track with this? Yes, you could come back and tell me, well, that keeps us from making sure things are not getting out of whack and we're not wasteful with materials. If I see something jump up to 12 or 13%. So yes, it could be a check and balance, but is it worth all the process to go through and get to that? And then is it even important to throw that in my job cost or not? Do I be in that? And that's a conversation that I get into fairly often, Jeff. If I'm going to tell you my gross margins on a water project need to be 72% because I'm building in 6 to 8% of materials cost, couldn't I just get rid of the 6 to 8% and tell you that my goal needs to be 80%
Mhm.
and just accommodate labor? That's the same number. I'm just squeezing in different places. So the conversation to have around that.
So what you're recommending is you don't break it out that individually and apply to each job. You do it collectively and then apply it to sales as a whole and see if the percentages work themselves out.
Correct. And the reason I say that, and again, I think we could have conversations with folks about where there's value and where there's not value, but that's the question that I would ask people to ask themselves is, does tracking that metric, does tracking that KPI, does tracking that number get me value towards making a decision about what I'm going to do next time I run into something similar? And if the answer is no, then I challenge you on why you're tracking it. And so as much as I like numbers and tracking all these things, I find that sometimes I've developed some calculus that doesn't need to be looked at anymore.
It's almost like that. Does this bring me joy? If it doesn't, throw it out. Is that what you're telling me right now? Does this bring me joy to my financial report?
That's kind of what I'm telling you. And joy should be down at the bottom called net profit. Yeah.
Joy is down in net called net profit. I love that. All right. So you're telling me revenue and gross profit, we still got to pay attention to. That's still super important. People are got to make sure we've got that dialed in. Now that we've got that and we're understanding where maybe we're not utilizing our time most efficiently, what other KPIs are you diving into that you don't think most other people are?
Yeah, Jeff, I don't know if you noticed, but I was answering the question about revenue and gross profit to stall so I didn't have to answer this question.
I know I brought it right back.
Yeah, yeah, I
We
noticed.
work for the same company, so I get to do that with you versus other guests. I would have let that go.
I appreciate that about you. Jeff, I really think that, and again, I will be careful, and I'm not stalling this time, but I will be careful about saying that the next set of metrics are things I would go look at. If gross profit and revenue are healthy, I may not spend a ton of time looking at this,
Mhm.
right? And I think that's a trap for us. Is though like we need to develop 45 KPIs for our company to run well, and I'm going to go, gosh, if these core 2, 3, 4 are working really well, then do I need the 45? So I would challenge that. Now, if you want to get to the details of some things that I would look at from that sense, Jeff, I think that I'm looking at cycle times and I'm looking at lots of different kinds of times. So I'm looking at overall how long it takes me to get a job done. So from the time I get a phone call to the time I get paid, that's a very interesting conversation for me. And I
Mhm.
might do something interesting like take the overall size of the job divided by that number of days. And then that gets me basically $1 of production a day. That's a metric that I've used in the past. That metric is a very fingerprint metric. And what I mean by that is it's going to be unique to each company. I don't know that we benchmark that well and say, hey, a well performing company should be $100 a day. I think we say that company XYZ should be 75 and we grade ourselves against each other. I don't know that that's a metric that we could benchmark very well. But I think it's one that could be very valuable for folks to kind of pay attention to and to look in. After that, Jeff, I'm really focusing in on, again, sounds like cycle times, but I'm
Mhm.
really focusing in on things like invoice lag. I'm really focusing on things like estimate lag, how long it's taking me to get numbers in front of my customers.
Mhm.
That's the biggest thing to me is figuring out what's going on there because all too often I find that, and we talked about this briefly last time we got together in part one, where we said, hey, if you stop at the P&L and L and don't go to the balance sheet, you could get trapped in the sense that profit looks good, but cash flow looks terrible.
Mhm.
Cash flow comes from cycle times, right? Cash flow comes from making sure I'm getting my billing in front of my customer as quickly as possible so that they can get in front of them, become a receivable, become receivable, then becomes a collection. A collection becomes cash.
Is there a set benchmark that you're using on either the estimate time or the invoice time?
And we'd have to be careful around that, Jeff, to make sure we define estimate time and invoice time very quickly. I would say that in my world, I'm really pushing for both of those to be within 48 hours. So if I finish a job, whether it's a repair job, a mitigation job, a plumbing job, I'm hoping that if it's a plumbing job, you're invoicing as you leave the job
I
site.
would hope so. That's quicker. Yeah.
Yeah. But on some of our other projects where we have those kind of things, and the costs are a little bit higher than your average plumbing project, I would say that, Jeff, I'm trying to get that billing package, whatever that means, in front of my paying customer in 48 hours. Because if I can have that sense of urgency around that for myself and my company internally, then I'm also telling my customer and my paying partner here that this is very important to me and I'd like to get paid. It's often I find that when we end up with and I know this from experience, Jeff, I raise my hand and say that I did this. I know that when I let my invoice lag example on a mitigation project extend into a week or two, say we got busy and we let it extend. Well, that really became not just a week or two extension on getting the invoice, but that became a month or two extension on getting paid because
Mhm.
I told everybody involved in that project, you know what? It's not that important to me. And they went, cool. We don't think it's important to us either. And yeah, so I just like to get paid. Yeah.
So don't run a not-for-profit organization, is what you're saying.
Everybody's their own. Yeah, you do yourself.
Mhm. Your mission statement. That works. All
But
right.
if you,
Because it's you and I can just ask you any questions, you're going to hate this one, but I'm going to enjoy it. So, a lot of owners collect KPIs. They want the data
Hmm,
and then do absolutely nothing with it. So, what are the structures? What are the rhythms? What's the routine that can turn KPIs into behavior change within the team?
okay. Um, Jeff, and again, I think it's important that we really explore a little bit about what you said about collecting KPIs. And I think that goes back to what I mentioned earlier with, hey, I want the set of the 40 KPIs that's going to help me run my company. And I often answer with, I can definitely give you 40 KPIs. We can talk through them and we could slice and dice in every way you want to. But is that going to provide value to your company? And are you going to know what to do with that? And I really like to divide or devise KPIs around action items, meaning that this is going to lead me to an action that I can take and something that I know how to do from it, or something I know that I can do as a step when I start seeing something come into play. Obviously, like I look at, let's just go back since we just kind of went down the rabbit hole on cycle times, Jeff, let's just talk about that invoice leg, right? If
Mhm.
I'm watching that invoice leg start to grow, do I have an understanding for why it's growing? The example I just brought up was, oh my gosh, we got into a surge. Okay, great. We got into a surge. We usually have 5 jobs a week and now we got 20. Okay. I will accept a little bit of a change in my invoice times or invoice lag because I know that I'm going to be writing a few more estimates than I had in the past. Do we understand what's going on? If all of a sudden we start to see a number trend up and we can't justify it or have a conversation around it and understanding, then that goes back to what we talked about in part one about asking that next question. Okay, tell me what's going on. Oh, Jimmy's been sick for the last week. Okay, great. So Jimmy's the only person in our company who knows how to write an invoice? That's a problem. And now
No.
and now we have an action item out of it because we've got one process in our company that only goes to one person. And I'm a firm believer that any process in my company that only has one person's name on it is a potential bottleneck down the line.
Let's jump into benchmarks because I hear all the time people saying, well, I don't know what the number is supposed to be. What's the industry average here? And we're going to say specifically to restoration, that's not an easy one to do because you got to factor in your local job market and the services that you provide, size of the company you are, if you're TPA, where the job leads are going. Uh, so, what's your recommendation? How does a company use benchmarking responsibly, especially when these numbers sometimes are really hard to find? You're almost chasing the numbers, and they may not necessarily fit your market or business model.
A question that comes up often is, hey, what is industry standard on since we talked about it, what's industry standard on gross margin? Where should I be sitting?
Yeah.
Um, well, that's a very difficult thing for me as an advisor to answer for you because I don't know what your mix of business is. If you're all construction, I should see it at one place. If you're all mitigation, I'd see it in another place. If you're all plumbing, I'm sure that's a completely different spot than either one of those altogether. So I really think it's really important to have a good use of benchmarking, that we do have an understanding of what we're going to be doing and what your business model looks like. And I am a firm believer in going and exploring and figuring out what's going on in whatever industry we're working on and seeing what the regulars are. But I would actually challenge owners and leaders of companies to go back and actually benchmark against themselves rather than benchmark against an industry standard. I'd rather you grade yourself against how you've been performing.
Well,
And
talk people through what's that process look like?
well, that goes back to what you're talking about with rolling 12s and those kind of things. I think we have to have some historical data. Now, you've been in company been in business 2 months, and you're telling me that I don't have anything historical, then yeah, you're gonna
Yep.
have a conversation around what's going on and set some industry standards. But let's start getting some of those metrics on the board so that we can start tracking what's going on there and seeing how it plays out. But I think it's important that we measure ourselves. Like I think I said it earlier. It's kind of like a fingerprint, right? It's unique to each company. There's a metric that's often thrown around that I'll use in as example here, Jeff, and it's kind of revenue per production employee.
Okay.
So with the amount of revenue I'm doing in a month, I divide it by how many people are in production. That tells me my revenue for production employee. Awesome. The industry standard in mitigation should be X. I don't know if there is an industry standard for that number, because what if you outsource all your demo on a mitigation project? That means that you only have two mitigation technicians and they did $100,000. They did 50 grand each last month. That is awesome. Your company is great. But you had all this subcontractor cost. So if you see the example there, being very, very careful with the numbers and how they're put together. That 50,000 makes sense when I graded against how my guys performed last month versus this month. It doesn't make sense when I compare it against, Jeff, how your company performed against my company. So I think really it's just looking at defining what you want to be paying attention to. And then, I don't care if it's on a bar napkin or a spreadsheet or something more sophisticated like all the, analytics and AI tools that we have now, if you want to throw it into some other system. But really it's starting to track how you're doing so that you compare this period that we're currently in against how you performed in the past.
The way I would relate that is, I used to be a runner. I know you still are. Uh, and you would track your times on when you go out on, I'd go do a 10-mile run today, and then I'd go do a 10-mile run the next week. And you'd track your time against the previous one, except last time you ran a hill that was a lot hillier and it was raining the whole time.
Absolutely.
It's no wonder you did a whole lot better. So yeah, you're right. You've got to compare the conditions that were in place if you really want to have an accurate review of how you're doing against previous performance. So if you're looking at one benchmark that you're dealing with back in when you were working in operations, or now that you're a coach, is there a specific benchmark that you fall back on and look into every single time that might surprise people if they want to pay closer attention to if they want to scale?
Hmm. I don't know that there would be one, Jeff, that would surprise somebody.
Mhm.
I, I really think I spend a lot of time around the ones that we've talked about earlier. I spend a lot of time around making sure that we're running a profitable company. So I spend a lot of time around the benchmarks for your company based on your distribution of jobs or where your gross profit is and how that translates down to net profit. But I spend a lot of time, Jeff, rather than just looking at that of like, oh, it should be 50%. I really spend a lot of time diving that down to your percentage breakdown of what's going on in your revenue streams. And I think it's important that we do that because not every job's created equal, right? My margins on a construction project should be different than my margins on a plumbing project, different than my margins on a air duct cleaning project, different than my margins on mitigation. Each one of those, kind of flavors has its own place. And I think it's very important that we pay attention to those kind of things. So I don't know that I have like some sort of aha benchmark that I jump into that people wouldn't look at. I would just say that I tend to, rather than just using the one blanket number, I come back and look at it and go, okay, what's your revenue distribution look like so we can have a better conversation there.
So people are going to want to talk to you, and your job back in operations or now as a coach at the end of the day was profit. This is a very difficult industry. We want to make more money in what we're doing. We love absolutely helping people and being part of the community. Big deal with that. And yes, we want that. But there's a lot easier ways to make a buck. So We want to make profit doing this. You're diving into these numbers now and you're looking at KPIs, you're looking at benchmarks. Where do you see companies unintentionally bleeding profit that maybe doesn't show up in the first glance?
Mm. Jeff, I think I'd go to something that I've seen a few companies that I coach with currently. We didn't do this at the companies I came from, but with hindsight, I probably would go back and look at it. Would be I've seen some companies start to track almost as a revenue stream. They track their discounts because that's one thing that's constant in our industry, specifically speaking to restoration, is that we invoice for 100 grand, and then we go through this mesh settlement process, and we come up with $85,000, and that's a whole nother podcast that you could probably talk to somebody more experienced in my of where that 15% comes in. But it is interesting to know that we're negotiating 15%. Um, and that might be a really, really nice kind of metric or place for us to pay attention to that I've seen only a few companies start to look at. And it leads to some really nice conversations around, did you know that for every dollar you invoice, you're giving away 15% of it in discounts for whatever reason, either because you're a nice guy or because you guys don't know how to negotiate well. And maybe you should have a little bit more conversation about how you can negotiate through a process. But either way, it gives you something to start tracking. And before you ask it, Jeff, no, I don't have a benchmark for how much you should negotiate. I think again, it comes down to the personality of your company and what you're doing.
I wanted to ask that too.
Oh, that's why I got out ahead of it. Yeah.
All right, Josh. So restoration companies often stay busy. I think we can all agree with that. But how do they struggle? They're busy, but they're still struggling with cash flow. Now, we talked earlier about not getting the invoices out in time and a few other issues that are out there. But what are the cash flow indicators that you would look at first?
Yeah, Jeff, I think you mentioned it at the beginnings of that. I think you mentioned even in the question. Yes, I'm going to go back and look at invoicing and make sure that's all paid attention to. So, assuming that we've got that in a healthy spot and we're paying attention to that, then I think I'm gonna go into some of those negotiation kind of things. Between the time I present an invoice, that's another thing I might be tracking, Jeff. Between the time I present an invoice and how fast I get paid, what does that number look like, and how can I start to influence that? That's a number that we would call turn on receivables. And
Mhm.
you heard other companies, I think out of QuickBooks, it's DSO, directly out of QuickBooks. And that metric is extremely valuable for us to be looking at essentially how long it takes us to turn a dollar of invoicing into a dollar of cash. And as I start to squeeze that number down, that means cash flow is coming in quicker. And that is a place, Jeff, that I think we can start to benchmark ourselves to get against some sort of industry standards. And we can start to definitely benchmark ourselves against ourselves to figure out, hey, our normal turn on receivables is about 40 days. What is happening right now that is trending towards 60? That's a very interesting conversation for me to jump into and say, hey, what is going on? Is it that, and I'll be honest, Jeff, I don't know when this podcast is going to come out, but we're filming this leading into the holidays.
Mhm.
What happens to cash in the holidays? I don't know if you've ever tried to talk to an adjuster between Thanksgiving and Christmas, but they're gone.
Yeah,
Uh,
mostly just for fun.
yeah,
Not
absolutely.
business.
Yeah, not business. You just call them for the fun of it. Yeah, we all
Yeah.
do. But my point is, they're not going to return your calls on negotiating during that period because I don't know what they're doing. I've never been able to figure out what they do in that window, but it's not work. And sorry to any adjusters that I might know, but they don't work that month. And so, Jeff, I look at it. Yes, my turn on receivables grows during the end part of the fourth quarter. Is that a trend that I can recognize? I can see kind of happening every year. Over the time that I was an operator, Jeff, we noticed that was the trend. The turn on receivable happened every fourth quarter. So we
Mhm.
had to in the third quarter for cash situations and put a little bit more in reserve. And maybe I didn't buy that truck in the third quarter because I knew cash was going to be tight in the fourth.
Well, you're buying trucks now, so let's jump into debt.
Ah,
So, where do you see debt being used effectively right now? Like, let's look debt as a positive to start with. Where are you seeing businesses use it the right way? And then we're going to move in. You just jump right into it as far as where do you see where debt's crippling people right
well, Jeff, I think again in your question you phrased it correctly. I would like to think of debt as a positive.
now? Mhm.
I think used appropriately, there's an appropriate way to use debt. I know all too often we hear companies just say, "Well, I'm debt free." Cool. That's great. Don't shy away from that. I love that thought process. But we're debt free, but we haven't made payroll in 2 weeks, or we're debt free, but our AP is some crazy percentage of our revenue. And so, yes, we're maintaining things, but are we really telling the story of what's going on in the company? So I think used appropriately, using just like with everything else we've talked about, Jeff, when you plan out the use of debt, I'd love to use other people's money when I can. If interest rates on my line of credit are at 15%, okay, maybe that's not so attractive. But if I can get an interest rate, with what's going on in the government right this second, things are moving in the right direction from an interest rate perspective. It's time for me to start using other people's money again, or at least thinking about it. And in that case, I'd much rather go take a debt payment to build some capital and use other people's money and extend that over time with a lower interest rate than necessarily take it out of my reserves to fund a project that I might be working on. So I think it's just being very intentional. And I think we've hit on it, even if we haven't said these words yet, Jeff, in either one of our little one or two podcasts here. We're talking about being more proactive and planning than we talk about being reactive.
Right.
Meaning, if you're planning an expenditure and you can lay out the path for how you're going to take on this debt and pay it back, I like that. If your engine blows tonight and you've got to replace the engine so you can get back in production, and you're going to throw that in your credit card, that's not such attractive debt, right? So I think we just kind of separate those two things is when we start to look at, hey, planned and intentional use of other people's money to fund my growth, or oh crap moments where we end up saying, hey, you know what? I have an Amex card and it'll cover that. As the points you get and the free flight you get um, doesn't make up for that 25% interest rate that you might pay.
Well, let's say we're talking to a company and unfortunately the debt's just gotten a little higher than they want to than they're proud of, and it's no longer a healthy level, and it's getting to impact the business. If an owner's trying to pay down the debt, what metrics, what habits, what strategies would you recommend that would have the biggest impact in doing so?
Oh, I think first off is just recognizing it, call it what it is. We've all been there, even if it's not in business. We've probably done it in our personal lives. And I think the first thing is just raising your hand and saying, okay, listen, I screwed that up.
Is
Uh,
that where that Michael Scott moment where I declare bankruptcy?
let's hope it's not going that far, Jeff,
All
but
right.
it's just raising your
But I declared it.
it is raising your hand and declaring and saying, yes, I did make some mistakes. And so working your way out, I think the first part is recognizing. The second part of it is a dollar. Put a dollar towards paying that down that debt that gets rid of the interest charges. If you ever want to do a scary thing, go take an interest theory class in college and watch what compound interest actually does when it's working against you or working in the favor of a bank. It's a very scary process. So everything that you can do to pay down that debt, it's just kind of getting first off recognizing it that you're in that spot and then getting started on a plan to go through that. I mean, there's lots of different strategies. Do you want to pay off the lowest balance? Because that may be a psychological thing. Just go pay that off and get done with it, or go after the high debt stuff. I tend to look at high debt because I'm not a fan of compound interest unless it's working for me. And so I'll go after that. Probably the high debt stuff, the high interest rate stuff first. Kind of tackle it that from that perspective and see what I can do. Could I translate? To give you a practical example, Jeff, could I translate some of my credit card debt if I have that it's expending over time, and open up a line of credit? Right? That's one place that when I start working with a new client, I find that all too often we have lines of credit that aren't there at the levels that we need them to be. And as a coach, I would recommend that you go look at a line of credit that's something in the area of 2 months of your revenue. If you could be in that spot, I know that sounds like a big number to some folks, but I'd love
Mhm.
to have that availability out there to be used when it's appropriate. And yes, I'd much rather go put $100,000 on my line of credit at an 8% rate than $100,000 on the various credit cards split up over between 20 and 22%. Even if it feels short term, we all know that in real life, sometimes those short term conversations become long term, and that starts to be, when I see lines on your P&L statement that say interest payments, that the doesn't make me feel good.
So we get heavy well, first before we even get there, do you have any kind of strategies for somebody who doesn't have a line of credit? Do you have any strategies, things that they need to know or understand prior to going to apply for one?
No, Jeff, I don't think there's much there. I mean, you need to have good, solid financials. If you walk into a bank and they say, "Well, hand me your financials," and you go, "What are you talking about?" That's probably not going to be a great conversation. So, I know that sounds basic, but yeah, make sure that you're back to what we talked about in part one, that you're in a regular rhythm around producing and reviewing your financials. If you feel like that's haven't got that you've got that picture, so you can paint that out there. That's banks aren't going to listen to how nice a guy you are. They're only going to look at what your books are. Um, a strategy I would have, Jeff, as especially if you're a newer business that's just getting started, is go after a regional or a local bank rather than going after, JP Morgan or Chase or something big. I wouldn't go after those folks to get your line of credit. I'd go after someplace where you can sit down with somebody, have a relationship, and start to actually have a banker, right? Instead of just a teller, if you want to call it that.
You seem like somebody who has a banker. You seem like somebody who you go to your banker to go talk about your finances all the time. So I'll take that advice from you.
All the time. All the time.
So yeah, here at Viola, we talk a thing or two about culture with clients and the importance of that. And then you have financials, and it feels like maybe sometimes financials and culture could compete against each other.
Mm.
If you have an issue in one or the other, it's going to affect the other one pretty dramatically. So, what does a financially mature leadership team look like in restoration? What do those conversations look and feel like? And what's the behaviors in play?
Jeff, I think if you're not careful around it, yes, they can definitely start to fight against each other, and they can actually start to one can tear down the other. I think it's very clear that you need to decide what kind of company you're going to be and how much you share about your financial picture. And the more you share, the more responsibility you have to make sure people understand what it is you're sharing. Um, because let's just be honest about this, right, Jeff? If I invoice $100 and I say I do that at 70 points of margin, that means that for somebody who doesn't understand the whole financial picture, it may just sound like, great, Jeff, you just made $70. You're rich and you're not giving me a raise. And then you start to try to explain that within that $70, I got to pay the rent and I got to pay the gas and I got to pay for workers' comp insurance and you name it. We could add all sorts of things into that $70. And when I look as the owner, I look back at that $70, I go, I'd be happy if I had seven. What are you talking about? $70. And so I use that as a kind of a silly example, Jeff, but that's a place where I feel like if you're not good about understanding or explaining to folks what's actually your financial picture is, it can actually start to degrade and tear down culture. And so I would challenge you that if you want to be, hey, I'm an open books company, I share my numbers with everybody. Cool. I like that. I like having the understanding, but make sure that the folks you're sharing it with also have an understanding of what you're actually telling them. Because if it's misunderstood, and you're not, they don't have the whole picture for what's going on, it can get confusing. And if it gets confusing, then that starts to degrade culture.
So let's kind of wrap it up here because you've given a lot of information over this session and the previous session that we did. So kind of put a bow on it right here. An owner who is really serious about using financial data strategically. Right now they're handing stuff over to the accountant. Accountant's telling them you're in good shape. But now they're ready to get strategic and using these things to make decisions, to ask the questions that we talked about in the first episode. What are the first three things? Let's leave with an action plan. What's the first three things that they got to set up and they got to start doing?
Yeah, Jeff, I think we talked about it in session number one, and I referenced the drum kit that's sitting behind me.
Hmm.
It's my number one thing is rhythm. You got to have a rhythm for how you do this. Like the companies I came from and the companies that I coached that are most successful in the first 10 days of the month, they have a very defined rhythm for what they're going to be doing from a financial picture, what they're going to be closing, what they're going to be looking at, what they're going to be paying attention to. That rhythm comes really into play and they keep up with that. Um, in today's session, Jeff, we talked a little bit about some of the action items that you could do from that. So that's the next piece is okay, now I've got the rhythm. I'm looking at those numbers. Now I've got to put the action in place. And then I think the third thing is Jeff, I don't know how to tie a ribbon on this, but I'll call it being brave. I think you need to be brave in how you're going to go through that. I think you need to be able to recognize and stand up when a mistake's being made
Hmm.
and start working on it. And I think you also then need to be able to celebrate when things are going really, really well. But so maybe brave's not the right word, but I think it's just having some having some gumption, some nerve around what's going to go on there. Don't be afraid. Be confident.
Love it. Well, hey, I very much appreciate your time and everything that you're providing to the listeners here of Violand's GPS podcast. If you like this episode, please give it a like, give it a subscribe, share it with friends, family, young ones, especially. Let's get the young ones involved in understanding their financials now so that they can retire at a young age, just like Josh, and be fabulously wealthy and own your own drum kit. So,
Mm,
Josh, thank you for being here. We appreciate it. If somebody wants to get a hold of you and they want to talk numbers, they want to talk financials, KPIs, how can they get a hold of you?
you can call Jeff Jones. Uh, no, yeah, you can obviously reach out to me via email, jbachman at Viola.
It's
Yeah,
pretty easy to hack. Yeah, all of our emails at Violand are pretty simple. First initial, last name at violand.com.
there it is. So I will answer them, or I'll pass them on to Jeff, one of the two. Yeah.
Well, Josh, thanks for being here. I'm going to hand it final comment over to you. Anything you want to say to the listeners on the way out?
No, Jeff, thanks a lot for having me. I appreciate not always the most attractive of topics, but I think a crazy important one. So thanks for having me. Thanks for listening, and I hope that it was helpful. If there's any other questions I could ask, or answer, I'm here for it.
Awesome. Thanks, everybody, for listening, and we'll be back shortly. Thank you very much.